Hey, everybody. Welcome here to this live community event here on Refactoring. Welcome, Andrew. Welcome, Andy. Welcome, Joel. Today, I'm excited to have Andrew Twyman here with us, who is, as of today, an engineering coach, but he was staff engineer at Dropbox and many other things across his career that spanned more than 20 years already. So, first of all, thank you, Andrew, for being here with us.
Thanks for having me. I think this will be a fun conversation.
Yeah, for sure. As you guys may have seen, I've written down a little bit of an outline in the community post about some topics that we may discuss. And these are very high level, heavy topics about engineering decisions that most engineers face, right? About velocity versus quality and development rigor or handling tech debt. And I'm excited to talk about this with Andrew because he has had such a diverse career. He has seen many different things, startups at different stages, different sizes, product maturity. So I think he can really comment on such matters from different angles. So maybe first of all, Andrew, you may tell us a little bit more about yourself, about your professional journey, and then we may dive into such topics.
Yeah, sounds good. I'm certainly happy to share what experience I have. That's what I do with my coaching mentees as well. When you suggested this topic, I thought about the experiences that I've had and like the parts of the startup life cycle that I've seen, and actually was surprised by how many transitions I've gone through and seen companies at different stages in a relatively few number of positions. So since graduating college, I came out of MIT in 99. I've only actually had 3 jobs, but more than that in terms of number of companies because of acquisitions, because of spin-offs, like different transitions that we went through. So I think that I got to see a number of different things. Let me talk through that kind of chronologically, I guess, to start
Yeah.
with and come back for more details. So my first company I joined just out of college was called Maker Communications. They made network processor chips, which were specialized CPUs that ran inside of routers. This was the early days of the dot-com boom and the internet.
Wow.
So I was writing the firmware that ran on those chips. It was all written in assembly, pretty exciting
Wow.
optimization stuff. It was a lot of fun. But that company, just as I joined, went through an IPO. And then about a year later, went through an acquisition by a bigger company. It initially was maybe like 70 people or so. We were acquired by a
Wow.
company of about 2,000 called Connexent. And then about a year and a half after that, we're spun off as part of a smaller part called Mindspeed. It was about 1,000 people, a subpart of
Okay.
Connexent that it spun off. So I went through a large number of transitions in a pretty short time. I left there partially because after a while it became a little bit too low level. Like I've decided that if I
Yeah.
couldn't write function calls or loops at some point, I was going to forget how to do that. Wanted to move up the stack a little bit. So my second company was called Liquid Machines. They did document and email encryption, security, and rights management. So DRM
Okay.
for Office documents and emails, controlling who can see sensitive data, whether or not you can print it, whether you can copy paste it into a different document, things like that. They had really cool technology underlying everything. And it was based on rewriting applications in memory to intercept system calls and apply safety checks and things like that
Sure.
there. As it turned out, that never really got that much traction. So it was always a
Mm.
struggling startup. It was about 20 people when I joined. It grew as far as 75 or so. And then when the big crash happened in 2008, we went through 3 rounds of
Okay.
layoffs. It was very
Wow.
painful, but that counts as another part of the startup life cycle that I guess I learned
Yeah.
from the way, even if it
Yeah.
wasn't a fun one. But it was still always such a great team and such a great code base and technology that it kept me there for a full 8 years. And so we got acquired by Checkpoint, which is a bigger security company out of Israel, who, in my opinion, didn't really know what to do with us and didn't have a great plan. So I ended up leaving after about a year. So that brings me to Dropbox, which is what you mentioned was my most recent experience. I joined Dropbox when it was going through hyper growth. I was at 200, 250 people, I think, when I joined. By the time I left, 7.5 years later, it was about 2,800 people. And most
Wow.
of that growth happened in, I think, the first 3 years. We were doubling year over year for a while during that time. So it was a very exciting time to be there. I got to work at a company of different sizes and always with a lot of
Yeah.
opportunities for leadership as well as to try
Yeah.
out new technologies and do new things. That was pretty exciting. I was a staff engineer at Dropbox. Technically, when I joined, I was just an engineer because we didn't have titles when I joined. There were no no levels. There weren't even really managers. That was a weird thing about Dropbox. They called them leads because they didn't like the word manager. But that changed over time, obviously. I left Dropbox a few years ago and spent a little bit of time in semi-retirement, which I'm still in now. I haven't decided what to do full time, but about a year ago, I started this coaching with Practica, which is a company started by Andy Sheff, who was in your session about a month ago. So people may have seen him before.
Yeah. He's
But
also in the audience. We can say hi to Andy.
oh, hi, Andy. He started that company and put out a call among Dropbox alumni for coaches. And I got started about a year ago doing that, which has been interesting. Allowed me to get different perspectives of what's going on in different parts of the
Yeah.
industry and what people's concerns are. So that's been quite fun. And I should
Yeah.
stop talking and let you actually ask a question at some point, but I could go.
No, but I wanted to add that this is actually how the two of us got to know each other, because I also did some coaching practice about 1 year ago, and if you remember, we ran another community event maybe 1 year ago exactly, also with Kate Houston, about engineering coaching, the role of coaching, and this is a theme that I love, so I would love to pick it up again later in the conversation. But I mean, your story is already fantastic. I knew bits of it because, of course, we have chatted before, but I didn't know the details from firmware of chips during the dot-com to Dropbox. It's an incredible journey. I'm even more excited about talking about these topics that we have picked up for today. The first one is basically lessons about balancing velocity with quality code or development rigor, which is one of the evergreen themes about where people from one camp to the other camp. And sometimes we always say that it depends, right? That's the trademark answer. But depends on what. That you are probably one of the best suited person to answer this question, having seen startups, for example, at very different stages. So my sub question would be, has your opinion changed based on the different experiences that you have had, and maybe at different times you had to take different trade-offs for this?
And yes, definitely my opinion has changed. I learned from experience and saw very different approaches. Actually, I think that two of my jobs, Liquid Machines and Dropbox, kind of form opposite ends of the spectrum in terms of how to approach rigor at the early stage in a startup, and then what happens as that plays out over time. To give more details on that, Liquid Machines had a very rigorous development process from the beginning. It had a large, sprawling code base in C++. Had a lot of coding standards, testing,
Mm,
static analysis. Like the way that we approached it was very cautious and careful. And that did pay off to some extent in kind of the robustness of our technical solutions. But it also cost us a lot of time and effort. Like we did a lot of building of our own libraries and customized tooling around our build and things like that, which was all great. I wish that I could have taken those like core C++ libraries we had, which were modeled after the Java APIs in terms of like their level of functionality, which is stuff that particularly at the time wasn't really available in C++, so we had to build it all ourselves. At any rate, all of that was great. It was fun to work on. It was fun to work with, and it enabled us to do a lot. But it also was the kind of thing that pays off when you get to have hundreds of engineers, thousands of engineers. And Liquid Machines, as I mentioned, never got to that point, right? We were a struggling startup for a long time. We got acquired. Then our code, I think it did get used by Checkpoint eventually, but it never made it big as a major product. So I think that
yeah,
was definitely a case where we put a lot of effort into rigor. We never got the payoff because the startup never made it big. And that was something that I kind of learned
yeah.
from. I think Dropbox did
Mm,
the opposite, where all of the early code that I experienced at Dropbox, and I wasn't there quite at the beginning to see the first versions being built, but I was there as we were dealing with those first versions and scaling them up and building new features on them. A lot of the early code that was hacked together by Drew and Arash in Python was quite messy. They did a lot of things that were trying to be a little bit too clever in terms of dynamic Python and things like that. So I'd say they had the opposite approach of Liquid Machines. They were very much do it quick and dirty, make it work, get there.
yeah,
But Dropbox, of course, is the company that did make it big, and the things that they built worked, and it grew over time. So they were having more users, more
yeah,
features to build, etc. So we got to see the opposite end of that trade-off where,
yeah,
okay, now that we're growing, now that we have hundreds of millions of users, we have to deal with some of the technical debt that came from those approaches in the early days. So
yeah,
I had regret, or I thought there was irony to the situation of, oh, now that I'm at a company that is succeeding, that does have this scale to deal with, we didn't invest early on. And
Yeah.
so we're paying for that now in a lot of cases by doing rewrites, by refactoring, by having to live with that tax.
Yeah.
So I feel like I learned from both of those to want to find that middle ground somewhere where you minimize the cost that you pay later if you didn't
Yeah.
think ahead, but you also don't overinvest in things that you aren't
Yeah.
gonna.
So do you think those were like two extremes, or you think that eventually, for example, the Dropbox situation was the right call for how things turned out? And liquid machines was more, the more extreme situation was more liquid machines where you didn't really see the payoff of
Mhm.
the of all the custom tooling, for example, while Dropbox actually ended up being the right call for how things were developed. Do you think it is this way?
I think it might be closer to the latter. That like
Yeah.
certainly in the very early stages of a startup, like I would prioritize getting your MVP working and like getting
Yeah.
things in front of customers and iterating more than doing
Yeah.
things perfectly the first time. That being said, I do think that there is still a trade-off to be made. Like I don't think that the early Dropbox developers did things quite the way that I would have done it. I
Yeah.
think that I did learn from that. I think that mainly, I think that the trade-off I'd look at is like how much are you investing up front for how much payoff later.
Yeah.
You don't want to overinvest. You don't want to put a lot of effort into things that might never be used at all.
Yeah.
In a startup, particularly, you're trying new things. You might throw it away later because it didn't succeed in the market, or you might
Yeah.
never grow to the point that you need that scaling from your back end.
Yeah.
But I do think that there's a lot of small decisions you can make with a relatively modest investment that set you up so that you won't regret what you did later. Things
Yeah.
like writing your code in a clear way or factoring it so that it can be modified later. Things like writing code that is maybe not fully optimized, but at least doesn't give away the easy points on
Yeah.
performance later. Those are the things that I would tend to, if I were guiding a new developer or a team, that's how I would guide people is say, let's not over engineer this because we might never have the second use case that this is generalized for, or we might throw this away entirely because this product line
Yeah.
never really takes off. But don't write messy code that people can't read. Do put comments in it, do invest in making it something that will be built, can be built on later. Because I
Yeah.
find it doesn't actually take that much investment to do that. If
Yeah.
you spend 5 or 10% on your development time early on, and then for the things that you do get to reuse, it pays off later, then I think that may be the right trade-off.
Yeah. It's very interesting because, of course, things are not black or white. It's a spectrum. So the optimal process is somewhere where you can take the easy wins, as you said, and
Mhm.
then defer probably the commitment to strong abstraction and custom tooling and things that is very heavy for later. And I think your angle when you talked about liquid machines is also interesting because the way many people think about the fact that it's not the best call to invest too much into super high quality and structured code at the beginning is that we talk about startup products as something that changes very fast. So you may end up with abstractions that are not valid, that don't fit anymore in the future. But it's not always like that. It isn't the only issue. You may set the right abstractions, but maybe you're building something that whose payoff is far in the future. So maybe you build the right thing, but the payoff is too far in the future, and that is still the wrong call, which still which looks like what you guys did with liquid machines. You didn't say we built something wrong. The tooling was fantastic, the C+ libraries, etc., but we didn't get to the scale that would allow us to benefit from all this work.
Yeah, I think that was a case of over investing too early. I mean, it made it from an engineering point of view like a great project to work on, and I think I learned a lot from it. But I do think that in terms of the success of the product, the success of the company, there was some over investment there, and it really does come down to it's a cost benefit analysis or like time value of money. That's in this case time value of time of developer time.
Yeah.
Like there, and I'm sure some economists probably could write a formula for okay, given this amount of time and this many developers,
Yeah.
how much in payoff do you need to get from your 1 hour of development time today? But I don't have anything like that level of
Would
rigor on it.
love if such a thing existed. Someone could give this formula to me. I just follow the rule, and it's fine. Everybody's
Yeah,
happy.
yeah. But I do tend to think that There's a certain level of rigor that I would just build into my standard development process, right? Like you do write unit tests, you do comment your code, you do pay attention to the contracts between your classes and your components. Like those are basic parts of software development to
Yeah.
me. And there are things that are so obviously going to pay off as soon as someone has to read this code again, or as soon as someone has to refactor it or add a new thing to it, that it's worth investing in because it will pay off even in the short to medium term. There are exceptions to that. Sometimes you're writing a prototype that you know you're going to throw away,
Yeah.
and you don't even spend time to write the unit test because all you care about is, does it like gather the data that I need it to gather. That can happen, but I would tend to caution people that if you do that, you better make really sure that you really are going to throw it away and that you really do, because
Yeah.
there's a tendency for things like that to not get thrown away. And then someone builds something else on top of it. And now a year down the road, you're suddenly supporting this thing that was supposed to be throwaway code. And it's really hard to work with. Be cautious about that too.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I wonder when it comes instead to the team, to how happy and satisfied are engineers with how the tech is developed. Did you notice differences? Are engineers generally more happy or only happy or on a spectrum of this related to how much quality you can put into the code? Or actually, even if you, like you said, throw away code because already code will be thrown away, there is a way for product people and the team and the culture in general to make people everybody stand behind this and understand what is the spirit of doing this without compromising the motivation of engineers who maybe want to build great tech.
I think that motivation depends on the engineer. I mean, some are much more motivated or focused on what did I build today? What can the product do
Yeah.
that it couldn't do before? What is getting in front of users, right? Some are more motivated by I solved the problem in a clever way, or I
Yeah.
built beautiful code. I think that really is something you have to approach with individual engineers case by case if I were mentoring someone or leading a team. But it's something that you can establish in a culture pretty early on. Like something I appreciated at Dropbox was that it did have a culture of the engineering being good. Sweat the details was one of the early values at Dropbox. And
Mm-hmm.
like in engineering, I think we did take that to mean that like we should pay a little bit more attention. Still not over engineering, still not doing more than we needed to, but it
Yeah.
did matter if the edge cases were covered because we didn't want to accidentally lose someone's data. Or it did
Yeah.
matter that kind of the different ways that a user would try and use something like would actually work the first time, because the magic of Dropbox Sync always was that it just works. That was also an early
Yeah.
motto. And that came from putting a little bit of extra rigor into thinking about how you build a feature in the first place. So that I think it is the kind of thing that you can build a culture around. And some, depending on the product you're building, the company you're in, maybe you want a culture that's more about moving fast and breaking things, to
Yeah.
coin a phrase that other people have probably heard. But maybe it's not. It really depends what you think is right for your situation.
Yeah. No, it totally makes sense. And speaking of Dropbox, speaking of this other experience where you said you moved more in a hyper growth mode, so creating technology very fast, and so maybe accumulating also more tech debt and having to rework stuff later. What's your take on handling tech debt in startups that move that fast? How was it for you? And looking back, what are the best ways for you to do?
And I think for starters, tech debt is always a constant struggle. I don't think I've ever met an engineer that
Who's happy
couldn't,
about it?
who couldn't relate when people talk about, oh, dealing with tech debt or legacy code or things like that. It's always going to be true. So I think that what I take from that is the goal is not to eliminate it entirely. The goal is not to never have technical debt, because if you're doing that, then you're building I don't know, you're building sample code for a lecture or a research project. You're not building a real product. But what I would say is it takes constant effort to keep that kind of thing under control, because it's not wrong to take on technical debt in the interest of solving a problem, right? I need to release this. I'm going to build a solution that works for the release schedule. I know that it's not going to work for more than 1,000 users, or I know that there's going to be this library change in 6 months that's going to be a problem. It's okay to make those trade-offs, but you do have to pay attention to it and stay on top of it. And my core kind of guidance on how to decide where to invest there is to focus on what is this tech debt actually costing you. If you treat it like actual monetary debt, I think it's the analog would be you want to pay off your high interest credit card
Yeah.
before you pay off your mortgage. You
Yeah.
and maybe you don't pay off your mortgage any earlier than you have to because that's a low interest rate and you can just keep paying it for the 30 years, however long it takes.
Yeah.
But if you're paying 20% on a credit card, you should focus on paying that off soon. So in technical sense, it's what is the tax that this technical debt is costing you? Does
Yeah.
it cost you in KTLO? I don't know how many people outside of Dropbox use that term, but keeping the lights on,
Yeah.
the way we
I use
refer,
it too.
okay, to work you have to do that doesn't really make forward progress. It just keeps things working. We used to focus a lot in my teams at Dropbox on like how much time are we spending on KTLO and where's it coming from and what can we do to reduce that so that we can spend more time on building new things. So if some technical problem is costing you KTLO on an ongoing basis because like bugs come up in that area, or every time you build a new feature, you've got to pay some extra tax to make it work for this legacy piece of your code. That's a
Yeah.
sign that it's worth actually investing in addressing this technical debt. On the flip side, if you've got a piece of legacy code that is ugly and nasty, but it's not really hurting anybody, like it's either not being used very much or like it is being used and it's just working, then maybe you don't invest in doing anything about it right now. You can do it later and it's not going to hurt anybody anymore because it's working. So like
Yeah.
that's a tricky call, but I think the core is what is it costing you? It's a cost benefit analysis. What's it costing you now versus what's it going to cost you to fix it?
Yeah. I think this is a great take. And much of this, I think it boils down to being intentional when you are developing something about the limits, the ceiling that these abstractions or these designs have. If you build something and already that maybe it won't scale more than X users, or this abstraction will not fit anymore if we go in this other direction. If there is this level of awareness in doing design, in my experience, good decisions are almost always made, but because you can make explicit all these costs, these operational costs, not just the upfront cost of developing stuff. But in my experience, the worst situation is where we have developed something without being aware and without being intentional about the fact that this would backfire in some way. It really resonated. Your take really resonated. Another angle that I love that I wrote in an article by the Riot Games team is this concept of contagion for technical debt that they
Mm,
try to prioritize for. So basically, address first technical debt that will they know it will get worse and worse over time if they
yeah,
do not address it. Because as you said, there might be things that can stay there and nobody touches them. They are not all that too harmful, but there are maybe better abstractions at the center of your code base where everything else is built on top, that it will be more and more costly to repay if you wait too much time. So maybe the dynamic nature of the dynamic costs are more important to be understood and take into consideration than, let's say, the upfront ones.
yeah. I think that's a great take. I haven't seen that article from Riot, but I think it's a good one. That some kinds of technical debt, some kinds of legacy code, it's just going to get worse and worse over time because there are going to be more use cases, more code that uses it, which means that doing the eventual migration is going to be that much harder. And I think that's a great example of a kind of tech debt to address earlier rather than later. I think to get to your previous point about kind of the awareness, I think it's great to have the awareness when you're making design decisions. I think that's the kind of thing that would go in a good kind of design doc or
Yeah.
decision process of how are we going to build this? Do we take this approach, that approach? One of the things to call out there is okay, if we take this approach, like what are going to be the landmines we're placing for ourselves later?
Yeah.
When might this hurt us if we choose this rather than that because it's less robust or it's less scalable? And going into that eyes open is important. I think the thing I would add to that though is you need some way of maintaining that awareness over time so
Yeah.
that a year later, when you are getting to the point where you've scaled up and this is going to become a problem, people remember that's a problem and realize that maybe now is the time to address it before it actually explodes, before you
Yeah.
actually get to the point where it's now your system has gone down and you have to address it in a hurry. And I think that comes down to how your engineering teams manage their tech debt and how they decide what to work on and what their priorities are. That I've never seen a perfect approach to that, but I've seen good usually like when things are going well, it's something that the engineering team themselves, the tech leads, the leaders on that team, have an awareness of their code base and will be empowered to surface what are the biggest problems I think we should work on. That's something I've actually guided a lot of my mentees in coaching to do. If you want to grow as an engineering leader, one of the things you can do is try and surface these technical problems and make a decision about which ones are most important, and then try and get buy-in for that and get them worked on. That's
Mhm.
something that a good engineering leader can do that will have a lot of impact if you're addressing the right problems. So,
Yeah.
like, from the point of view of how do you make that happen, I think it's about empowering the engineering teams to to own the quality of their code base and the quality of their products. And they need to carve out, and the organization needs to let them carve out at least some amount of time to deal with that. And
Yeah.
every team I've been on has approached that a little bit differently, but sometimes it's in each sprint, we have a certain budget of our time that is going to go to tasks that we select from the engineering backlog rather than things that are coming in from the product management team.
Okay.
Or maybe it's dedicating a week, like in a
Mm.
row at some point to, we know that we have a bunch of problems in this area. We're going to a week between sprints and go address that and have an
Yeah.
organized effort for it. There are different ways of approaching it, but it's something that I think engineering teams need to be very intentional about and carve out time for.
Yeah, I also agree 100% about engineers owning basically this kind of impact and this kind of activities. So basically, you're advocating for having a separate swim lane for this maintenance work and tech debt repaying that is time that is self-directed by engineers. They can use it to address these kind of tasks in parallel with feature development. Maybe it's 80-20 or 70-30, whatever, but every sprint people can spend some time that is self-directed on these issues.
Yeah, like how self-directed it is, I think will depend on what the team wants. Putting some structure on it to make sure that it's used for the right purposes, I think is good. I wouldn't just say every engineer, hey, you have 20% of your time to do
Yeah.
whatever you want. That may be good for other things. I know Google used it to encourage innovation, but if it's quite that undirected, I think that it may not actually get the outcome that you want, which kind of
Yeah.
makes sense for if you don't direct it, then it isn't directed. But I think that at the team level, if you say, okay, we're going to save a certain amount of our sprint capacity when we're deciding which tasks to do during sprint planning, and we want to address like these top issues that our technical leadership has identified, or these things that we know are going to be an issue coming up. Like at Dropbox, we
Yeah.
often had things like major migrations, or when they had to upgrade the Linux version on the servers and things like that. Like every team has to contribute to this. It has a deadline. Let's get started on that earlier rather than later is the kind of thing that would go into that bucket. One other thing that I wanted to add to this topic from the other direction, somewhat surprisingly, one of the things I found was most effective at dealing with tech debt at Dropbox was Hack Week, which was
Mm.
something we did twice a year usually, which was a very open-ended, like, it's Hack Week, all engineers, actually everyone, get to pick their own project, go do something, learn something, do something fun, build something new. And that certainly wasn't directed at tech debt in any particular way. But in a lot of cases, a lot of the interesting projects I saw come out of Hack Week were tech debt focused, or engineers know what their pain points are. And if you give them
Yeah.
a week to work on whatever they want, at least some of them are going to decide, I want to address this thing that is annoying me.
Yeah.
And they'll do things like migrate the repository from Mercurial to Git, or in one kind of meta case, a friend of mine built a technical debt tracker that would
Yeah.
like scan the code base for instances of a pattern or a library or something that you wanted to migrate away from, and like track progress over time. These are all things that helped us deal with the tech debt in our code base that came out of really just giving the engineers free time. So I do think there's a trade-off to be made. I think that giving people the empowerment and the free time to just work on whatever's annoying them the most will deal with a certain amount of tech debt. But then also, I think you do have to be intentional about it and let the engineering leadership, particularly I'm thinking of like the technical leadership, not so much the
Mm.
managers, let them have a input and decide what the most important place is to direct that.
Yeah. I love the example of the hack week because yes, it might seem counterintuitive because you might think you give people 1 week to work on anything, they might come up with incredible side projects with exciting tech. But when you think about it, probably top of their minds, there are those things that bother them day in and day out. Those bottlenecks, things they struggle with. It's just natural that they come up first with things to solve those issues. So it's counterintuitive the first moment that you hear this, but maybe then it makes a lot of sense. And
Mhm.
did you notice that the kind of issues that were addressed this way, maybe across the full week, are the same issues or different issues than those that you address during regular maintenance time during the week? Maybe it's bigger problems. And do you think that there is a difference maybe between how you should address small maintenance items and small tech developing versus larger initiatives that should be maybe more also directed top down other than being surfaced bottom up?
Yeah, I definitely think that, and the technical debt items that got addressed during Hack Week were the ones that wouldn't get addressed otherwise.
Yeah,
Generally, they're like, if I were an engineer picking a project, it makes sense. So like, if I'm going to do this as part of my day job anyway, why spend my Hack Week doing this particular work?
makes
Um,
sense.
so it's either things that wouldn't be addressed anyway because no one other than me thought they were important enough, or
Mm.
maybe because they're just too disruptive. They're going to take too much time. No one's going to ever give me a full week out of my sprint to focus on this because we
Yeah.
have too many other things. But Hack Week becomes an opportunity. So the flip side of that is I think that there is a lot of smaller scale tech debt that doesn't need that amount
Mm.
of like dedicated focus time to be dealt with, and should be done as part of ordinary work. Like at the very smallest end or kind of most integrated would be, I think it's important that when someone is like working on a given piece of code, a given class, improve it while you're there. And that's the way
Mm.
that I think probably the majority of tech debt really should be addressed is, okay, when you're touching that code anyway,
Yes.
maybe improve it in some way. Like if it doesn't have documentation, add that. If it's, for a long time at Dropbox, we were gradually adding static types to our Python code base. We didn't, for the most part, like force people to just go and sweep their entire code base and add types to it. But when I worked on a function, I would add types to it before I started, because right now I'm thinking about this function. I know what the inputs are. I know what the outputs are. I can put types on it very
Yeah.
easily. So
It's like
that
the Boy
also,
Scout rule. It's
sorry,
the Boy
what?
Scout rule, right?
Yeah, leave
To
things better
just
than you
leave the
found them.
code in a yes.
Definitely agree. Yeah, and that often is the answer I give to a mentee that asks me, like, should we invest in fixing this problem now or not? It's first going back to that, what's it costing you that I mentioned earlier? Like, if it's not costing you actively and you're not actively touching that piece of code, maybe it's okay to leave it alone for now. But if you are, the next time you actively touch that piece of code, that's a good time to go ahead and also do any kind of delayed refactoring or other things that are
Yes.
waiting for that piece of code. And that's a good thing to remember as well.
And do you think, because I've written about this in previous articles, and some comments that I've received from readers are about the fact that it's not always easy to make other stakeholders like PMs and other people that are non technical, especially, to accept the scout rule when it comes to the fact that it might take a little bit more of time to develop anything because you might add some test that wasn't there. You add static typing, as you were saying. Do you think this works because it is part of a culture which understands engineering and puts engineering at the center? You said this at the beginning, that even though you wrote code very fast, you were under hyper growth all the time, but Dropbox has always been a very engineering focused company.
I think that's true. And I think it's something that does have to be part of the culture, but I think it's natural to a lot of engineers to want to make code better.
Yeah.
And I think probably the only hurdle you have to get over is instilling that sense of ownership. That if you're touching a piece of code you don't see as your own and you don't take pride in, then maybe you're going to be incentivized to do something quick and dirty and get in and get out as fast as you can, right?
Yeah.
And sometimes that's the right call, right? If all you have to do is change one line of code, change the one line of code and move on, that's fine. But if this is something that you are going to have to maintain, even if you didn't write it, and if you're going to make significant changes to it, that's a good time to take ownership and to make things better while you're there. And I think it realistically, it doesn't take that much extra time in most cases,
I
because
agree.
if you're writing if you're writing your own code carefully, and if you're writing some tests for it, and if you're going through code review and all that stuff, like a lot of that is a fixed overhead to much extent. So adding a few
Yeah.
extra lines to add static types or to factor out this function that you're working on so that it's no longer 300 lines long, like that kind of thing isn't going to add that much overhead, and it's going to it would cost a whole lot more if you came back and did it on its own separately later.
Yeah, and I agree that it's also beneficial to ownership, because one thing is you just slide in and you have to make this small change and then you leave. It's very transactional. Another thing is thinking that you are making a little piece of code better, actually. You are doing some contribution. I know it's not tangible, maybe, but I think it makes a difference in the culture, in how people think about the way they do the work. Maybe it's just me, but over time, I think it compounds and creates a better culture overall.
Yeah, I think that if and it's something that grows naturally by example once it's there. Like once people see others, oh, when I read this code review, I noticed that you didn't just make the change you had to make. You made things better. I want to do that myself next time.
Yeah,
It's something that naturally builds on itself once it's part of the culture. It does have to be instilled by the senior engineers at some point, but I think it's very healthy once it's there.
yeah, totally agree. I have a question now about more of your coaching activity, but before we dive into that, would love to ask if there are any questions about these topics that we've touched that were anyway very close one to the other, about velocity, quality, and technical depth. Happy to take any questions in the chat. Otherwise, I just go forward, because I would have hundreds of questions myself. So if you like 10 hours, I could easily fill them. So let us know, guys, if you have any questions. Joel is interested in hearing more about coaching. Perfect. So I was just about to ask that, because while we were talking throughout the whole conversation, and sometimes you've said this already, this is something you have discussed with your coaches, with your learners in your coaching activities. What has been your experience with coaching? How you do it? What kind of help do you think it provides to people? Because my personal belief is that this is still an undercovered topic, that should be discussed way more than it is, unfortunately. And I love the work that you and the guys at Practica and other products are doing to make this more popular. So we'd love to hear from you about your experience for this.
Yeah, it's been interesting. I got into coaching last year because I wanted to get back to learning and seeing what was going on in the industry. And like for me, it's been an interesting growth in perspective.
Mm,
But in terms of the value I'm providing and what I'm doing, it's to some extent a natural outgrowth of what I did when I was working full time on a team as well. Like a good technical leader should be mentoring those around them, should be helping them to get better and to grow technically as well as growing in terms of their collaboration, their leadership, like all of that. To some extent, that's a manager's responsibility to help their team grow, but I think it also is the responsibility of technical leadership to do that because they can provide like the technical perspective on somebody else's growth. If you're ahead of them a little
yeah,
bit on your career path, you can provide that. The flip side of that is I think that as an external coach, as someone who isn't working with my mentees day to day, like I have to focus on slightly different things because I think that a lot of kind of direct technical mentorship happens best when it's in the context of working on a project together. I know someone is building a feature and they need to think through the design. If I were their tech lead on their team, I might sit down with them and talk through design alternatives with a whiteboard or look at their code, and maybe we might do some pair programming for a while. Or there are lots of ways of working together and building that
yeah,
context. That's something that is harder to do for me to do as a coach because I'm not working with them day to day. We have limited
of
time
course.
together. So I think that as a result of that, like while I have helped some of my learners with like technical skills, it's been at a higher level because I don't have all the context on what they're working on and I don't have the time to go high touch with them. And also, if they want to learn new technical skills, often the right way to do that is with an online course or documentation,
Yeah,
or there are other resources other than coaching that are best suited. What I think I can provide as a coach often is the things that rely on perspective, that rely on an external perspective. And maybe you didn't think of it this way. Be like, there's a different way of seeing this problem that someone internal at your company isn't going to see because they only experience things from the perspective of their technical system. So that's one thing I can provide is my experience and having seen things differently. The other thing that
and
I find I can provide a lot of input on is the things that are universal, like the collaboration skills, the leadership skills, like how to grow into a technical leader. Like that is a lot more universal and doesn't really depend on as much on
Yeah.
exactly the product you're working on, at least not beyond a certain level. The mentee can explain to me a situation they're having, and we can talk about how to manage technical debt is a good example that I have had those conversations frequently. And like for that, like there are techniques that I've used in the past or that I've seen used successfully that we can talk about that would apply at any organization. So I think that tends to be where external coaching is most useful, is like it's providing the external perspective that you wouldn't get internally, and then it's
Yeah.
working on those universal kind of leadership or collaboration skills that have a technical aspect to them but are not like deeply embedded in the details of the particular technical problem that you're solving.
Yeah, that's a great answer. And I think those cases is where not having that shared context into that work is actually an asset, because you can provide this perspective in an objective way, because otherwise conversations between a manager and the report always share some context, and maybe the both of them think that something is okay, while you instead you can jump in and say, hey guys, this is not okay, this is not how you can do things, and provide this kind of perspective. And my question is, based on this, do you think that there are some jobs, positions, or levels that benefit more or less from coaching, or this is beneficial maybe in different ways for across the ladder, in from junior fresh ICs up to executives? What has been your experience with this?
I think it depends on what you want to get out of coaching and what resources you might have like internally within your company, within your organization. I think that probably the higher level you get, the more the external perspective is going to be valuable because like
Hmm.
by the nature of the size of your organization or the kind of that there are fewer leaders than there are individual ICs, like you've got less perspective, you've got fewer different opinions to draw from in terms of finding a mentor, particularly a mentor
Yeah.
who is ahead of you on their career path. If you're the one of the staff engineers at a company, there may not be that many principal engineers that you can get mentorship from.
Mm.
It doesn't have to be someone who is actually senior to you in the job hierarchy. That's just an example. I think that like a for an individual IC, the first place I would send them is like who on your team can give you mentorship. Who should you work with on this project? That really should be built into your project planning on a good team. That like, hey, if
Yeah.
you're the new grad on the team who hasn't learned the technology yet, let's pair you with someone with a little more experience on your first project, and they'll mentor you and help you through it. That should happen naturally. If it's not, then that's something to debug on your team. And then the next layer after that is if you, it's good to have more formal mentorship that isn't just working with someone on a project, but the first place to look for that, I think, is on your team or on adjacent teams, like within your organization, because those people are going to come in with more of that context and therefore are going to be able to help you out. So I think there's more of a need for an external coach, like what I do as you get to a higher level. And like my learners tend to be people who are mid to high level ICs who are looking to grow into the like staff principal kind of level. That part of that is because of my level of experience, like that I'm what they're looking for. But I would say that kind of I'd recommend people start internally because that's going to be easier to set up and easier to share context with, and then go
Yeah.
externally when you find that you can't find what you want internally, or
Internally.
when you're kind of at the level where that is getting more and more valuable. One other comment I wanted to throw into something that you said, I do think that one of the things that an external coach can provide is a perspective on if your assumptions are wrong, if the assumptions of your organization are wrong. And
Yeah.
maybe that's something that's true at every level.
Exactly.
That one of the things I can do for one of my mentees is point out if, hey, your relationship with this manager doesn't sound healthy to me. Or your assumption, the way that you're approaching this problem doesn't seem right. I disagree. I mean, because I don't have all of the baggage that comes with being your manager, being reporting to you, whatever, like I can say that. And the worst thing
Yeah.
you can do is stop coaching with me. So like that I think is a kind of perspective that some people might need at any level, particularly people who like are struggling to grow their career or people who are struggling with issues of discrimination, like women in tech or minorities in tech. Those are
Yeah.
cases where I think that having an external mentor may be very valuable. That
Mm.
isn't something I've personally provided as much as a white guy. If you're a woman in tech, I may not be the person you want to talk to about that. That I think that also is an area where external coaching and mentorship can be very valuable.
Great example. Yeah, I agree. These are great examples, and I agree about the difference also between what you need maybe when you're an IC or even a senior engineer, still a lot in the trenches of writing code, and maybe you need for mentorship, you need a lot of shared context from somebody that really understands the insights of what you're doing, as opposed to someone at the higher level where maybe a more general perspective might become more valuable for direction for their career or just to get more impact. That was a great take. I don't know if there are other questions in the audience. Otherwise, I have a couple of mine about coaching specifically. If anybody from either Joel or Andy or Martin or Roberto may ask any questions, I go on.
While we're saying this, it might be a good time to throw out that I'm in the community on refactoring. If folks who are watching
Yes.
the video have questions later or want to chime in and have more of a discussion around these topics, I'm happy to take part in that. So keep that in mind.
That was a great plugin. Yes, that's exactly how we run these things. Of course, there's the live part of the event, but then we upload the recording in the community. So the conversation is always a blend of synchronous stuff and asynchronous comments where people can jump in later if they couldn't join the event. So I have another question myself, Andrew.
Mhm.
I think you made a great point about looking for mentorship and coaching even inside your company, because that's that's not something that is necessarily worse or better than external coaching. It's just different. So my question is, if you are an engineer, an IC, or even a manager, should you look intentionally for this, or reaching out to somebody who is more senior than you or even your a peer of yours and ask for mentorship, like in some kind of official relationship, having a one-on-one or a call every once in a while? So how would you go for it?
Yes, I think it is something certainly to be intentional about, and that it's something that ideally should be built into the way a team is structured and the way that
Yeah.
new hires are onboarded. Like starting with like when you're a new hire, like you should have some kind of a mentor who's going to help you through learning the code base, learning your way around, et cetera. And every company does that a little bit differently, but that's where you should start. And beyond that, I think as an IC, if you aren't getting what you need or you feel like you could be growing faster, like that's something that I would start first talking to your manager about, and they may be able to direct you to another one of the senior ICs who might be a good match to be a mentor for you, whether by working together on a project for starters or going into some kind of a formal cadence of let's have one-on-ones every couple of weeks and talk about what you feel like you need
Yeah.
to learn, or it can be as formal or as informal as you want.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think that a good manager should help you with that. And if they're not, then that's something to do on your own, that maybe you reach out to someone on your team or on another team and say, hey, I feel I could use some advice on my growth or on learning these technical skills. Do you have some time to work with me? Or maybe you go outside to someplace like Practica and you end up working with someone like
Yeah.
me. It's an option. A lot of companies will even sponsor and pay the cost of that, though I've had mentees who paid their own way as well and found it
Yeah.
valuable. Like all those options.
Yeah. I agree. I think these are the right options and also in the right order. Like you should try this and then that, and I agree. And I will pick up another question from Joel here. I mean, how Joel is asking, how do you balance offering mentorship versus coaching? So maybe being either more prescriptive with advice, like working as a mentor, or more about introspection, goals, open-ended questions when it comes to coaching. So how do you balance this?
Yeah, I'm not sure that I have a clear idea of the difference. I have a personal style, and I have seen that personal style is quite different from other people. An example of that, when we had that refactoring session about coaching and we did some kind
Yeah.
of live coaching examples, if you go back and watch that video, I gave a lot more direct advice when I was answering questions. And the other coach who was with us, I'm sorry, I'm blanking on her name.
Kate Houston.
Oh, yes. She took much more of a kind of Socratic dialogue approach. Like she asked questions, never really made statements like that. And I found that fascinating to watch because it was so different from how I approach this. And it's something that I actually want to learn from. I think it was very interesting to let people come up with their own solutions. So yeah, I think I have a style and I do what works for my learners, but I do try to give general advice, but not tell them exactly what to do or exactly how to solve a problem.
Yeah.
But then I think that like what another thing that a coach can provide that they might not get otherwise is accountability. Okay, if we've discussed this thing and decided that
Yes.
it's a good idea for you to go propose like how to manage technical debt on your team, right? That's then I can check in with you in 2 weeks and say, okay, did you do that? Like, how did it go? Like, did you get feedback? And like just having someone else who's going to check you on that. If I'm on the opposite side of that, that would help me stay motivated to actually
Yeah.
take these steps that are about my long-term growth, not just my day-to-day things, code that I have to get written and checked in today.
I think that accountability part is one of the hidden benefits, but a very great one about coaching with an external person, because it really makes things happen. Because maybe even if you know already what you should do by yourself, you need some push, you need some like external energy that helps you with that. And that kind of accountability, the fact that you need to show up with that person maybe every couple of weeks or so, it's powerful, makes things happen. I'm aware that we have just a couple of minutes, so we are picking up the last question from Martin, which is more about the first part of the talk. So Martin is saying, Andrew, that you were quite clear about the trade-offs between the various aspects of writing quality code, like unit tests, readable code, etc. The question is there like a right time, or is it ever too early to define policies around, for example, testing, or is it ever too early to have a well-defined technical strategy, basically to think and structure these things?
I think that depends what you mean by policy and what you mean by strategy to try and address that in a more useful way. Like, I don't think it's ever too early to write unit tests. It might be too early to, maybe that's not true either. If you're writing your first prototype, maybe you start by seeing if you can get the basic thing to work before you test it. But I personally would include unit tests earlier in development than a lot of people would. If by a policy you mean like a written document that says how you write tests and is enforced by management in some way, like it probably, there are times when it's too early for that. If your team is
Mm,
small enough, you should really just have a culture and you should check each other on, are you writing code carefully and did you bother to test your code? And that should be something that the engineers just do as part of their day to day. You don't need a written policy, but I do think that if by policy you just mean, is there a way that you do things, then like it's never too
yeah.
early for that. Like, it's, if you have a standard way that you know how to write good code, then you should always follow that when you're writing code, I think is how I would say.
Yeah.
To the second part of the question, is it ever too early to have a technical strategy? I think a technical strategy is a spectrum, not a single
Agree.
thing. So yeah, if you're in your early startup phase, then your technical strategy might just be, here's the thing we want to build, and we're going to do our best to build it. And today, here's what we're going to try. And tomorrow, maybe I'm iterating on something else, something different approach. So that can be a technical strategy. It doesn't have to be written down. It doesn't have to be formalized, but like it's a strategy. And then as you grow, like formalizing your technical strategy mostly is about how many people do you have to communicate it to. And if it's just you in your head, then you can have a strategy and never write it down. But if you're on
Yeah.
a team, something probably has to be written down on like, how are we going to approach this problem? Or where do we want to be in 6 months? Like, how do we want to build out this new part of the system? So I think
Yeah.
it does come with what stage are you at in that life cycle.
Yeah, personally, I'm a big fan of addressing these things as a spectrum, as you said. Probably it's never too early to write down, for example, a document, small doc about your principles around engineering, how you should write code at a high level, and likewise, very high level tech strategy. But then if you grow, if your team grows, you will naturally outgrow those documents and you will need more detail. Engineering
Mhm.
principles become more principles, become eventually career frameworks, become more and more detailed things about how people should behave, how people should write code. And but this is not just about writing code. So I think the best answer is what you said. It's addressing these things gradually as
Mhm.
whenever it fits. So thank you so much, Andrew. It was a fantastic interview. I loved all of your points, took a lot of notes, and I will publish this in the community. And I will probably also create a newsletter edition out of this event that we had to recap all the things that we discussed. So thank you again for being here with us.
Thanks for having me. This has been a lot of fun.
Thank you also, guys, Martin, Joel, Andy, who joined the event. And see you soon again. See you in the community. So have a great day. Talk later. Bye,
Bye,
all.
everyone.